$500 to the last man standing. Anyone in this arena who can put me down and keep me down walks out with the cash." Darren Kowalski said it. The way a man says a thing he has already decided is true. He stood at the center of the wrestling mat, a folding table of bills to his left, a wireless microphone in his right hand. And he meant every word of it. He was 28 years old, built across the shoulders like a canal lock, and he had just finished putting 3 men on the mat in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. A rugby player from Guelph who outweighed him by 30 pounds. A former amateur wrestler from Sudbury who had trained for 15 years and lasted 11 seconds. A young soldier on leave from Petawawa who came down from the bleachers grinning and left them rubbing the back of his head with a dazed expression that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with confusion. Each one stepped up, each one went down. Darren Kowalski had never once, in 6 years of doing this at arenas and sports expos and MMA showcases from Winnipeg to Halifax, put a man on the mat he did not want to put there. "Come on," he said to the crowd, scanning the upper rows of the Saskatoon Fieldhouse, where the Western Canada Combat Sports Invitational was in its second afternoon. "Someone in here hasn't had enough," and in the back corner of the upper section, in a seat he had chosen specifically because it was close to the aisle and far from the noise, an old man in a dark green wool jacket set both hands on the handle of a walking stick, pushed himself slowly to his feet, and raised that stick perhaps 6 inches off the floor. Not a wave, not a shout, just a slight lift, the kind of gesture a man makes when he knows he has been seen and is simply confirming it. If you have ever watched someone enter a room and felt the air change before you understood why, type airborne in the comments right now. Because you are going to understand that feeling before this story is finished. His name was Leonard Carver, and he was 73 years old. He had come to the Fieldhouse that afternoon because his granddaughter Melissa was competing in the junior judo brackets on the far end of the building, and Melissa was 11 years old and had been training since she was 6, and Leonard Carver had not missed a single one of her tournaments in 5 years. He sat through every match. He ate the bad concession hot dogs without complaint. He waited through the delays and the bracket reshuffles and the announcer feedback. He was there because she was there, and that was the whole and complete reason. The walking stick was a straight piece of ashwood, plain, no carving. He carried it because the right knee had a titanium component in it that the surgeons at CFB Borden had installed in 2009, and on cold Saskatchewan afternoons in late October, the joint announced its presence in a way that made stairs interesting. He wore the knee the way some men wear reading glasses. Necessary, unremarkable, not a subject worth discussing. The people who sat near Leonard Carver at these events came away with the impression of a quiet, polite grandfather who perhaps had worked in forestry or spent his career driving long haul. He let them think it. He had never in his life felt the need to correct that impression. He had learned in places and circumstances that had no good names in peacetime conversation that the men who filled every silence with their own history were usually the men who had the least of it worth keeping, and the men who said almost nothing were usually the ones whose silence had been earned the hardest way. Darren Kowalski found him in the upper section, and his grin widened, and he waved the old man down with a flourish of the microphone. "Absolutely. Yes, sir. Please come down here. We'll get you a softer part of the mat." The crowd laughed. The crowd always laughed at this part. Leonard Carver did not laugh. He simply set the ashwood stick, found the step, and began making his way down toward the mat. One step, both hands on the rail, and then both hands on the stick when the rail ended. No hurry about it, no performance. Just the careful, considered movement of a man who has learned that getting somewhere quietly is usually better than getting there fast. Darren Kowalski watched him come and was already half turned to the timekeeper, already setting up the next bit of business, when the old man reached the edge of the mat and stopped. "You sure about this?" Darren said. He was not unkind about it. He was genuinely asking, "I can give you the 50 just for coming down." Leonard Carver looked at him for a moment. His eyes were grey and level and entirely unbothered. "Whenever you're ready," he said. That was all. He did not take off the wool jacket. He did not set down the stick. He did not shift his weight or widen his stance or do any of the things a person does when they are preparing to fight. He stood exactly as he had been standing when he stopped walking, like a man waiting for a bus. The crowd was still chuckling when Darren shrugged, handed the microphone to the table official, and moved in. He came the way he always came, low, patient, reading the old man's feet for the shift that would tell him which way to move, looking for the lead leg, cataloguing the balance. It was not arrogance, it was method. He was genuinely skilled, and genuine skill respects its opponent enough to observe before it commits. He gave the old man 2 full seconds of that observation, which was more than he had given the soldier from Petawawa, and what he saw was nothing he could put a name to. The old man was simply standing there, hands on the stick, eyes forward, a quality of stillness that Darren had never once encountered in 6 years of doing this, and which registered somewhere below conscious thought as something worth paying attention to. But by the time that registration reached the part of his brain that made decisions, he had already moved. He went in low and left, a feint toward the right knee that he had used to open against wrestlers 100 times, and the moment his weight committed to it, the world reorganized itself. It took approximately 3 seconds. Most of the people in that building would spend the next year arguing about what they had actually seen, and none of them would be entirely wrong. Leonard Carver did not step back. He did not brace. He turned, not much, less than a quarter turn, a small internal rotation that moved his center of gravity perhaps 4 inches to the right, and the ashwood stick planted once into the mat like a spoke into a wheel's hub, and his left hand came forward and made contact with Darren's right forearm. Not a grab, not a strike. Contact. A precise economical contact that redirected the younger man's momentum by a margin so small it should not have mattered, and mattered absolutely. Darren had committed forward and left. The 4 inches were all of it. His base evaporated. The old man's hip was there, exactly where physics required it to be, and Darren Kowalski went up and over it the way water goes over a stone. Not forced, not thrown, simply redirected, and he hit the mat on his back with an impact that the building heard. And then there was nothing. No crowd noise, no announcer. The woman at the timekeeper's table had stopped writing mid-word. Melissa, 11 years old, 3 brackets away at the junior judo end of the building, looked up from her warm-up routine because something about the silence reached her even across that distance, and she could not explain why. Leonard Carver had not let go of the stick. He had not shifted his coffee from where he tucked it in his jacket pocket. He stood with the ashwood planted between his feet and looked down at the young man on the mat with an expression that was not victory and was not satisfaction. If it was anything, it was the expression of a man checking to make sure a door is properly closed. Darren lay on his back and stared at the ceiling rigging of the field house. He was not hurt. He catalogued that fact with the methodical clarity of a man who has spent years learning the difference between injured and surprised, and the answer was clearly the latter. But something else was happening that had nothing to do with injury. He had felt in those 3 seconds a quality of movement he had never encountered in any gym or on any mat or against any competitor in any bracket in any weight class he had ever entered. It was not strength, it was not speed, it was something that existed in a different category from either of those things, something that felt less like being defeated, and more like being politely shown a fact about physics that he had previously overlooked. He sat up. He looked at the old man. The old man looked back at him, patient and unhurried. The building came back to itself all at once. Not cheering, not the sound a crowd makes for a fight. Something different, a sound with mass to it. And then, from the 5th row, a woman stood up. She was perhaps 65, silver-haired, wearing a red fleece jacket with a Royal Canadian Legion pin on the breast. She had a stillness about the way she rose that made the 6 people around her go quiet without being asked. She walked to the edge of the mat with the deliberate pace of someone who has waited a long time to say something and is not going to waste it now. "Master Warrant Officer Carver," she said. Her voice needed no microphone. Leonard turned. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly. Something older than surprise and quieter, recognition. "Sandra," he said. The woman's name was Sandra Dufour-Belleil, and she was the chair of the Saskatchewan chapter of the Royal Canadian Regiment Association, and she had been looking at the back of Leonard Carver's wool jacket from 5 rows up for the past 20 minutes, telling herself she was imagining it, telling herself that Leonard Carver would not be at a combat sports expo in Saskatoon on a Wednesday afternoon, would not be sitting quietly in the back corner eating a hot dog like any other grandfather, and had been wrong about all of it. She turned to the crowd. Her voice, when it came back, had the particular carrying quality of someone who has spent years running meetings in church halls and Legion branches and has never once needed to ask for quiet twice. "Some of you may recognize me," she said. I'm Sandra Dufour-Belil. For those who don't, I served 22 years with the Royal Canadian Regiment, and I currently chair our Provincial Veterans Association. The young man on the mat trains in a system of close-quarters combat that, if you follow the lineage of its instructors back far enough, traces through several hands to a training program that was overhauled and rebuilt at CFB Gagetown in the early 90s. The man who was central to that rebuilding, the man who trained the people who trained the people who trained Mr. Kowalski, is standing in front of you holding a walking stick and a cold coffee, and his name is Master Warrant Officer Leonard Carver. A sound moved through the bleachers. The kind of sound that happens when a large number of people simultaneously understand that they have been wrong about something important. Darren Kowalski, still sitting on the mat, looked up at the old man with an expression from which everything complicated had been removed, leaving only a single simple thing: attention. But Sandra Dufour-Belil was not finished. "That is not why I'm standing up," she said. Her voice changed. It lost the meeting chair quality. It went somewhere private and honest, and the whole building leaned toward it without knowing why. "I'm standing up because I served with him, and because I spent 20 years not knowing how to say something that needs to be said out loud, and I am not leaving this building today without saying it." She paused. The field house was as quiet as a building containing 800 people can be. In the summer of 1993, I was a corporal. I was 26 years old. We were on a UN deployment in the former Yugoslavia, and there was a situation in a village outside Srebrenica that I am not going to describe in detail because some things don't need to be described to be understood. What I will tell you is that there were 3 of us pinned in a building that was coming apart, and the radio was gone, and the vehicle we'd arrived in was on fire in the street outside, and the reasonable assessment of the situation was that we were not getting out of it. She stopped. She cleared her throat. There was a warrant officer I had worked under for 2 years, steady man, the kind of man who, when things go wrong, gets quieter instead of louder, which sounds like a small thing until you have been in a situation where loud means dead. I had watched him for 2 years and thought I understood what he was. I did not understand what he was. She looked at Leonard Carver, who was watching her with grey eyes that gave away nothing and held everything. He came back into that building 3 times. Not once, 3 times. He came back in the first time and got Warrant Deschamps out through a window in the back wall. He came back the second time for Private Leclerc, who was 18 years old and had a piece of cinder block in her shoulder and could not have walked out on her own. He came back the third time for me. I was conscious. I was mobile. I had no excuse for still being in that building except that I was 26 years old, and I had decided somewhere in the preceding 40 minutes that the situation had no exit, and I had made my peace with that, and he came back in and looked at me and said, in the most ordinary voice I have ever heard a human being use, "Corporal, on your feet. We're leaving now." Her voice, which had been steady, was no longer quite steady. On the way out, the back wall came down. He covered me with his body going through the window frame. He took the impact of most of it across the right side of his back and his right knee, and he did not make a sound, and we were 50 meters away, and he still did not stop moving. He pushed us both all the way to the tree line, and then he sat down very carefully on a log and said, "Give me 5 minutes." And then he put his hands on his knees and breathed, and that was the only acknowledgement he ever made of the fact that he was hurt. She reached up and touched the Legion pin on her fleece jacket. They rebuilt his knee the first time in Germany. He refused medical discharge, told the doctor he had work left to finish. He finished 3 more postings. He spent the last decade of his career running close combat and self-defense instruction at Gagetown and Borden, teaching young Canadians how to come home, how to end a situation in 3 seconds instead of letting it become 30 minutes of something. Nobody recovers from cleanly. He was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal and recommended for the Star of Military Valor. He never talked about any of it. Not once, in all the years I have known him, have I ever heard Leonard Carver tell a single story about himself that did not involve someone else doing the important part. The field house was very still. I have been trying to find words for what I owe him for 30 years. I have drafted 3 different speeches and thrown them all away because they felt like the wrong shape for the thing they were trying to carry. Today I am going to say it in the simplest language I know. He went back into that building for me when any reasonable accounting of the situation said he should not have, And every day I have lived since then has been possible because of that decision. And he has never once in 30 years mentioned it to me. Not once. Because in his understanding of things, he simply did what was in front of him to do. He does not regard it as exceptional. He is wrong about that. He has always been wrong about that. And he is the only thing I have ever known Leonard Carver to be wrong about. Somewhere in the building, someone started crying. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way people cry when they have been caught off guard by something true. Leonard Carver's hands had not moved from the ashwood stick. He stood with it, planted between his feet, and his eyes were very bright, and he was looking at Sandra Dufour-Belleil with an expression that had moved past the usual stillness into something unguarded and human and old. He said very quietly, "You were never just sitting in that building." She looked at him. She shook her head slowly. "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it then." "I know," he said, and that was all that needed to be said between them, and the building somehow understood that it had just witnessed the end of a 30-year conversation. Darren Kowalski had not moved from the mat. He was still seated, elbows on knees, watching. His face had the expression of a man doing a very rapid and very fundamental reassessment of something he had thought he understood. He was 28 years old. He had trained every day for 6 years. He had gone to seminars and studied under good teachers, and had, not without some justification, believed himself to be among the more capable people he was likely to encounter in most rooms. He was rethinking that framework with some urgency. He got up off the mat, not fast, carefully. The way you move when you want the movement to mean something. He turned to face Leonard Carver. He came to attention, not the approximate version, the real version. The version that takes a particular kind of instruction to produce, and that once learned does not entirely leave the body. He had done a 2-year stint with the Canadian Forces Reserve before his combat sports career, and whatever else he had forgotten or let lapse that he still had, he held it. "Sir," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, "I have been doing this in front of crowds for 6 years. I have put a lot of men on that mat, and I have been very sure of myself while I was doing it, and I want you to know that I am aware of the difference between what just happened and everything that came before it. I understand now that I did not put those other men down because I was particularly good. I put them down because none of them had sat where you've sat. None of them had learned what you learned. None of them had paid what you're paid to know what you know." He reached into the pocket of his training jacket and produced the $500. He held it out flat across both palms. "This is yours," he said. "You won it fair, and I want you to take it. And if you don't want it for yourself, then I want you to tell me where to send it, because I've been running this act in Canadian arenas for 6 years, and I have never once set any of the money aside for anything, and I would like to start today, with your guidance, if you'll give it." Leonard Carver looked at the money. He looked at the young man holding it. He looked at it for a long moment with an expression that moved through several things that were not quite readable and arrived somewhere that was. He did not take the cash. He put one hand over Darren's and pressed the bills back toward the younger man's chest. "Keep it," he said. "There's a Legion branch on 20th Street that runs a program for young veterans who are having trouble with the transition. They do it on about $40 a week and the goodwill of 6 volunteers. Take the 500 and the next 3 times you run this show and put it all there. Tell them Carver sent you. They'll put you to work." Darren Kowalski nodded. His throat moved. "Yes, sir," he said. "And one more thing," Leonard said. He was looking at Darren with steady grey eyes, and there was something in his voice that had shifted from the flat calm he had maintained all afternoon into something with instruction in it. The voice of a man who spent years teaching and has not entirely stopped. "What I did to you today, you felt the mechanics of it, yes? You felt where your weight went and why?" Darren nodded. "Good. That's the education. Most people teaching this work spend all their time on how to put a man down. Not enough time on what it costs to do it wrong. Not enough time on how to read a situation so it never gets to the mat at all. The best outcome is always the one where nobody goes to the floor. Remember that. Teach that. It's the harder lesson, and it's the one that keeps people alive." The arena came up out of its seats the way arenas rarely do. Not for a winner, not for a score or a performance or a highlight. For something older than any of that, something that does not show up in competition brackets or YouTube metrics. Something that moves through a crowd the way cold air moves through an open door. Sandra Dufour-Belleil crossed to Leonard and put her arms around him. and he accepted it with the same economy he had accepted everything else that afternoon, completely, without excess, without performance. He put one arm around her and held on for a moment, and then they separated, and he looked at her with grey eyes that were not dry and did not pretend to be. 30 years, he said. 30 years, she said. 3 rows up, Melissa, sir, had appeared at the top of the stairs leading down from the main corridor. She was 11 years old, in her judogi, her hair up, her bronze medal from the junior bracket hanging around her neck. She had finished her match 20 minutes ago and come looking for her grandfather, and found the entire east end of the building on its feet, and her grandfather standing at the centre of it with a cane and a cold coffee, and an expression she had never seen on his face before. She came down the stairs carefully. She threaded through the people who had moved toward the edge of the mat. She reached him and slipped her hand into his free arm and looked up at him and said, with the directness of 11 years old, "Grandpa, what happened?" Leonard Carver looked down at her. The expression that had been on his face, the unguarded, human, old expression, softened into something else. Something that had been there all along and was simply more visible now. "Old business," he said. "Nothing to worry about." She looked at the woman in the red fleece. She looked at Darren Kowalski, who was still at a kind of attention. She looked at the crowd, which was still watching her grandfather. "Did you win?" she said. "I was never competing," he said. She thought about this. Then she held up her bronze medal. "I got third," she said. "I know," he said. "I watched the whole match. You broke her grip in the third sequence. Your instructor's been after you about that for months." She looked slightly embarrassed. "I know." "You did it when it counted," he said. "That's the only time that matters." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can we get hot dogs? The real ones from the far concession, not the ones by the entrance." Leonard Carver set his cane. He put his hand over hers where it rested in the crook of his arm. He began walking slowly toward the concession on the far side of the building. The crowd made a path. He did not acknowledge it. He did not look back at the mat or at the money or at Sandra Dufour-Belil, who was watching him go with an expression that had been 30 years arriving and had lost none of its weight in the carrying. He walked with his granddaughter toward the hot dog concession, one step at a time, the ashwood stick setting the pace, and to the 800 people watching him, he looked exactly as he had looked when he came in. An old man, quiet, a little slow on the right side, in a dark green wool jacket that told you nothing at all about the person inside it, which was of course precisely the point. The quietest man in any room has usually already paid for all the rest of them to be comfortable in it. The ones who never tell you who they are have generally already shown you, in the places and the moments when showing cost them something real. You just have to know how to look. And most of us, if we are honest, only learn how to look when it is almost too late. If there is a Leonard Carver in your life, if you know someone who carries their history the way he carried that cane, without complaint, without announcement, without asking you to understand the weight, leave their name in the comments. Not for us, for them. So they know that someone somewhere noticed. We'll keep finding them, one quiet afternoon at a time.